For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barb Piscopo. I'm the director here at the Lorraine Historical Society. Welcome. How many of you, is this your first time here? Several of you. Okay, well, welcome. Welcome to the Lorraine Historical Society at Carnegie Center. I'm very privileged today to introduce a good friend of the Historical Society, and I know a good friend of many of you, Dave Hibbard. I believe 2 years ago, maybe now, Dave did a program on the Root family, and we've invited him back. This is part one, so that must mean there's going to be a part two. Okay.
Yeah, I guess you're going to allow me back.
Okay. Is it going to be this year or next year? Do you know?
I think you're going to make it next year.
We're going to make it next year?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Caitlin Donaldson, who's our curator, is not able to be here today, and she and Dave have worked all this out, which is why I apologize, I don't know. So this is part one, and in this presentation that Dave will give today, I don't know why there's all this feedback. You're going to learn about 5 members of the Root family. And Dave has done, as you know, extensive research on this, and it's very near and dear, obviously, to his heart. The information that he has compiled has come from his own archives and the archives of the Root family. So I'm sure that you will enjoy his presentation. It was very popular last time he was here. So welcome, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. This morning, as she has already told you, I'm going to go through a number of people in the Root family who were in advance of Harriet Root. That was my program last time. Just to briefly introduce myself, I've already done it once, but some of you are new, so I'm going to abbreviate this. I was not born here in Lorraine, but I was raised here in Lorraine. I graduated from the old Lorraine High School that sat down at 6th Street in Washington. And if my mind recalls correctly, that was demolished about 10 years ago. I went on and earned a baccalaureate degree from Ashland College, which is now Ashland University. And that was in 1968. I went into the workforce, which lasted for about 37 years. I spent time as a public educator in telecommunications, part of which was over here at the old telephone company on 9th Street, in state government and regulation, and then finally the automobile industry. So if you look at me now and you say, geez, Dave, we're all over the board. How would you describe yourself? I would probably say a jack of all trades and a master of none. So I got wet in a lot of areas, and yet it was some great experiences, and I think it helped to build me into the person that I currently am. So with that, by the way, some of those jobs took me to 4 other states, and I was out in the Lorraine area for about 20 years. But I ended up in Georgia, Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois in no particular order. So let's get started this morning. I'm promising to try and get you out of here in an hour. That didn't happen the last time I was here, but I noted nobody was sleeping, so I suppose that's a good thing. I'm starting 4 generations back with the man who was my 4 greats' grandfather. I know who you are. Former student. Okay, let's begin with a gentleman named Harriet Root. He built a home for the then Root family in Sheffield, Massachusetts, and it was 1750. I know not too much about him, but just a few basic facts. He, in fact, was a colonel in the Massachusetts militia in the Revolutionary War, so that makes him a full-blooded patriot. I'm now going to move to my 3rd great-grandfather, who was Henry Root, and things become a little more detailed here. Henry was the Root who took the family from Sheffield, Massachusetts to Sheffield, Ohio in 1816. Now, one of the things that embarrassed me when I started to produce this program for you this morning was that I was always told there was Henry, his wife Mary, and 2 sons. Aaron, who is very well known around here because of involvement with the Underground Railroad and the Burl family, whose old home estate is over on West River Road. And there were two sons, William H. Root, who was my twice great-grandfather, and his older brother, who was Aaron. So I get into this thing and I find out there wasn't just 4 people that came west on this trip, which I'm going to describe to you. There were 8. I, much to my embarrassment, found out not only there were 2 sons, there were 4 daughters. So Henry had his hands full to move everybody out of Massachusetts and bring them all the way down here in 2 covered wagons to this area. So here's what we have. Aaron Root was the oldest, and I want you to note the pattern of birth. Aaron Root, 1801. William H. Root, my great-grandfather, 1803. Then you had 4 daughters. Julia Ann, 1805. Jane, 1807. Frances, 1809. Mary, 1811. 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. So if there are some of you here who were raised in the Roman Catholic faith, you might be saying, oh, this is a bunch of Catholics, they're practicing the rhythm method. And I'm sorry, they were Congregationalists. Okay. So, William left some documentation, and it was about a 6-page affair. He entitled it Things I Remember. Now, one of the things he did, some 60 years after he made the trip, he sat down and he wrote out his experiences. These come out of a notebook that was in existence somewhere in the late 1870s. We don't have the notebook anymore, but somebody, thank God, took that notebook and made a transcription of it. And so, drawing from those, I've got a few notes that I'll share with you about his journey this morning. He starts out by saying that the day they left Sheffield, Massachusetts was a very, very sad day. They were leaving family, they were leaving friends, they'd been established people of the community. They were not coming back. Most of these people they would never see again. Now they were headed for here, Sheffield, Ohio. And as I think some of you, if you're local residents, you know that from your history classes, perhaps in Ohio history, that this area was also known as the Firelands. The reason being that a number of families in New England were burned out during the Revolution, and in the early days of the government, they granted grants of land to those folks here. I cannot prove this to you, but originally the Roots were not supposed to come. They knew another family that had the rights to come here. They said, we've decided not to come, we'll rebuild here in New England. And Henry Root said, I'll jump on the chance, we're moving, we're going to Ohio. So, their journey starts, and early on, I know, they had 2 wagons. One was pulled by a team of oxen, and a horse in front. It was called a wedge, because you had 2 animals and then one. It kind of, from the air, would look like an arrowhead. And I suppose that's because the oxen were kind of like, duh, with the power behind the wagon, and the horse was up there. It's like, come on, fellas, I know where we're going to go. But they had that to really tow their heaviest things. Now the other team was in another wagon, and they had to split themselves. It was a team of bay horses, as he calls them. I don't think bay horses were race horses. These were horses designed for heavy-duty work, plowing, and so forth. 3 days out, they hit Albany, New York. They stayed there with a relative of Henry's and rested and refreshed. They went through New York, and it's interesting. Henry, or rather I should say William, describes the area as old country. and it was settled. I find that a little hard to believe, but that was his interpretation because the country was still young. And they were actually entering what was the western United States at that time. He says they moved through the Mohawk Valley, and he describes places that they went through. Utica, New York, Syracuse, Canandaigua, Rochester, Batavia. And he said one of the worst days of the trip was in the Mohawk Valley. The reason being, it was springtime. You want frozen roads when you have covered wagons. And there was a thaw. And he says one day they worked from sunup to sundown and traveled a grand total of 4 miles. And they were muddy, they were dirty, they were tired. But they got past that. They finally arrived at Buffalo. Now he indicates Buffalo at that time was about 200 or 300 folks. And at the time that he wrote this little journey out, it was actually 150,000 in the 1870s. He said there wasn't much of Buffalo at all, and the reason being is that the United States had just finished the War of 1812 with Britain. So guess who had visited Buffalo? The British Army. Put a long story short, they were a little careless with their matches. And so the city of Buffalo was being rebuilt from all the fires that literally burned that city to the ground. Now they moved on, and he notes that beyond Buffalo, there were no barges to cross rivers and creeks. There were no bridges. When you came to a river or a creek, you had to figure out how you're going to get across that. It should be noted that their wagons were sometimes built like boats with wheels so that they would float. Kind of like the old Conestoga wagons that you see, but their wagons were a little different with the tarps and so forth. They made it out to a thing called 18 Mile Creek west of Buffalo. And you think, well, why was it 18 Mile Creek? Because the creek was 18 miles west of Buffalo. He says when they got there, the creek was flowing rapidly. There were ice flows. And then when they arrived, there were other people there. He mentions teams. So he's talking other folks in covered wagons. And he said they're all sitting there looking at this and trying to figure out how are we going to get across this to continue the movement west. So what apparently happened is one fellow said, well, you know what? You got all this junk flowing down. It comes to the lake. It's piling up. Let's go out and explore the ice on the lake. To make a long story short, they took their wagons, their teams, and went out on the lake. It was still frozen enough. Went around the big ice pile up. They probably had to go out a quarter mile, get around that, and then come back to shore. And then they were finally on the other side of the creek. He said what was amazing is that every one of the teams made it through that. He says animals broke through the ice, wagons broke through the ice, but he says by the end of the day, everybody had gone out, gotten around, no property was lost, no one drowned, no animals were lost. And I think that's absolutely amazing. That must have been frightening because I remember being on the ice myself one time, putting my foot through a crevice. I suddenly had a soaker up to almost up to my crotch here when it was cold. So, all right, so he also notes the fact that he said they had small lakes around where they were, but they all marveled when they got to the road going down the lake of all the water and the ice. And they said they were just enamored with this thing. They'd never seen so much water. And he says the other thing about it is that the road from Buffalo to the 18 Mile Creek started out on the land, and suddenly the wagon tracks go to the beach. So they're on the sand. They go down the sand a little while later. Oh, there's some wagon tracks going back inland. So he said most of the road was actually the beach. That's how wild it actually was. They got past that, and they said there were almost no settlements at all. They went through Erie, Pennsylvania, which was a very small hamlet, but there was very little there. And so they pressed on into Ohio, where he said, thank God the weather got better. And he notes that in Lake County and Ashtabula County, they actually started running into a few more people than they had back in Erie, Pennsylvania, which surprised him. So there were some people that had come on ahead of him. He expressed the fact that Cleveland was a very small town, and several people there said, you know what, this place is dangerous. You ought to try to make a go of it here. And Henry apparently said, our claim is out west. We've got another few miles and days to go. We're going out. We're not going to stay here. So they went ahead and crossed the Cuyahoga River on a ferry or a scow until they came to the Rocky River. Now, he expresses a difficulty in getting across the Rocky River. And I don't know how many of you have been to the Rocky River Reservation. If you've been down there, you know there's a huge shale bank. Okay? He says they got there and they noted there were two fords. One was upstream, about, I think he said so many rods, about a quarter mile. He said if you got across there, there was a crag in the wall. They could barely fit wagons up and go up through there with their animals. And there was another one farther down by the shore where they were. They said they watched one wagon go through, got their gumption up, and they decided to take their wagons through and go up this crevice in the bank. What must have been just unbelievable was the fact that it took 2 days to get up the bank, to get their animals up, to get their wagons up. Again, everybody came through, no damage, no injuries, nothing. They finally made it to what we now know as Avon Point, and I brought this up in the last presentation. You go down here to the lakefront, and if you were to travel East Erie Avenue, Lorraine, into Lake Road, through Sheffield Lake and Avon, what you're looking at now is 1,000 feet or so farther inland than what used to exist. So the road that they were following is now airspace 25 feet over Lake Erie, about 1,000 feet up from the current bank. But that's the road they came in on. And he said they got to Avon Point. There was an old widow there. They stayed with her. And then they started out the next morning and they had no feed for the animals. But in pioneer spirit, he said a gentleman coming in from Lorraine, or it's actually Black River, actually had feed that he was bringing with him. So he essentially said, well, I'm on my way into Cleveland. I'll get some more. Take my feed your animals and go. And so on the 1st of April of 1816, 6 weeks after they got here into this area, they arrived down here at the mouth of Black River. Keep in mind, there was nothing down there. Black River just flowed directly to Lake Erie. No jetties, no breakwaters, nothing. At the end of his thing, he mentions that they came here in perfect tact. How they did it, I don't know. They managed to escape illness, starvation, no loss of property, no loss of their animals. They were all here whole. And he, at the end of his note, says, I at some time may come back and visit this again to explain to you some of the difficulties we encountered after we arrived. Now, I've gone through an awful lot of paperwork in the last 10 years that were in the Root documents. And I'm sad to say that I never found anything more from him. He never went back to it. So we don't know what some of those things would have been that he would have discussed with us. Again, this was from a notebook. That notebook is gone, but we have the transcription. Now, he grew up here as the land developed. And in 1827, he was a man of 24 years old. And like all guys that are 24, 25 years old, if you haven't already, you start to note that there's members of the opposite sex in your midst. So, he's dating somebody by the name of Sarah Eliza Case. And they're in fact engaged. Now, we're all adults in the room. So I'm going to read this letter from William to Eliza. I would rate it mildly R. So I think you understand what's going on here when I read it, okay? And it, you know, the thing with the concept of hot pants, This isn't just a 20th century thing. This existed in 1827, okay? And that's 197 years ago. So, this was written in Black River, December 19th, 1827. And by the way, Eliza is in what is now Vermilion. Dearest Eliza, again I enter upon the pleasing task of communicating my thoughts to you under the impression that it may afford you some gratification in hearing from one who is likely to become nearer to you than any earthly friend. It's typical 19th century language. Yes, my dear Eliza, I look forward with sanguine expectations of happiness to that period when we shall approach Hyman's altar and dedicate ourselves to marriage, and know that I may not be disappointed in the enjoyment of that pleasure in anticipation. I think I know what he's getting at. All right, so I have but very few moments to spend in writing. I should therefore not enlarge on the above, but leave it to decide, hoping for accomplishment. I commenced school teaching the next Monday after I saw you, which has kept me very snug in business, although the school has been very small as yet. I've engaged for 2.5 months, which expires about the middle of February. This, I think, will be in season to meet my engagements, but if anything should happen that will tend to frustrate the design of our being united at the time proposed, I will let you know of it. I contemplate seeing you in the course of 3 or 4 months, but if I should not be disappointed in that, as I have always been in having visits from you, I shall devise some method that I believe will not fail. It is about school time, and I have not had breakfast, which will take as an excuse for not being more lengthy. And indeed, I think you will have task enough after having read this. If you receive this in season to have a letter reach me in 4 weeks from this, please direct me at the Black River Post Office. Accept this as it is, for I have not had time to correct it. Scholars all around me. He was a teacher. Now, what's interesting is that about 10 years ago, I went over to the old Brookside High School, what was then the middle school. They were getting ready to tear it down. So I went over because that's where I started teaching some 55 years ago. And the remnants of those efforts are living and breathing people at this one particular table back there. I went over to the Brookside dedication right after. It was a pretty large affair. And I'm sitting there not expecting much, and one of the people said, "We're proud to dedicate this building in the spirit of one of our district's earliest teachers, William H. Root." And I'm sitting in the audience, and it's like, whoa, that's my great-great-grandfather they're talking about. So this is proof that he, in fact, was one of the earliest teachers in the district out there. Okay. I don't think anybody was offended by that, were you? Very good. All right. So he goes on, and he becomes a very well-known citizen in the community. And one of the things he does soon after is he marries Eliza Case. He did win her hand. They had 3 daughters. The first was Mariah, who I'm going to discuss. She was born in 1829, died 1888. A second daughter was Harriet, not to be confused with the Harriet Root that I talked about last time I was here. She was born 1831. That's all I know about her. She's lost to history. And this is what usually happens. Thank you. This is what usually happens when you have a daughter. Grows older, falls in love, gets married, gets her name changed, and disappears. So she's lost to history. The third daughter was Sarah, born 1832. We do know that she achieved adulthood, was married, but was dead by the time she was 22. 1832 to 1854. That wasn't the only heartbreak, because following her death, Eliza Case dies. He loses his wife. And so for about a year, he starts to court again, and he finally meets Frances Day, who he will marry about 1833. That brings 3 sons. The first is Orville Root, who is my great-grandfather, and then the famous or infamous Root twins, Will and Walt. I'm also going to discuss them. He became a member of the Whig Party. The Whig Party eventually dissolved and he became a member of the Republican Party, and in fact ran for county auditor in 1856 and was one of the early Lorraine County auditors. He was also a man who was prominent in the community at that point. He was a very successful farmer. He also took his turn at running the grist mill. Now, I don't know very much about this, but if you know where East 31st Street is on Lorraine, and you run into Sheffield, and you have West River Road, there's a bridge over the Black River. There was at one point a grist mill. And what apparently happened was it was run like a co-op, and farmers would take turns year after year nominating somebody to be the administrator to run the grist mill. So he apparently did this from time to time as well. He lived on through the 1870s when he wrote his story about coming west, and into the 1880s lived a reasonably quiet life, passed away at the age of 86 in 1889. So that is William Root. We also have some certificates and other things. I have a book up here on all these people. I know there's a lot of you here today, but if you're in the mood for it, you can come up and take a look. He was also a justice of the peace when they were legalized here in Ohio. Those were citizens appointed to do the job of a judge who were simply civilians. They did not have legal backgrounds. And eventually in 1912, the state did away with that. Okay. Orville Root, the first son of the second marriage of William H. Root, born was 1837. He lived more or less as a rural farm kid in his first years. He was an early graduate of Elyria High School in the 1850s. Now, I don't know exactly if a high school back then was 8 grades and you were out. I suspect it was, but he finished. And he went on in that rural environment until the Civil War. There's a mystery here that perhaps I've created. He was about 25 years old at the beginning of the Civil War, 24. He was fighting age. But if you know some Civil War history, you'll know that a lot of the soldiers that fought the Civil War, either side, were between the ages of 18 and 23. But he was still fighting age. He did not know. Now in the Root papers, I don't know why, because there's some really weird stuff that happened. The Roots knew a lot of people, and some of their stuff got into the Root stuff. There was a gentleman named Swartwood who lived nearby, and we have the paperwork for him. He was drafted in 1862, and I'm not going. I'm going to get somebody else to go for me. And that's how they did it back then. You could get around the draft. So there was a fellow named Rotterdam, and we've got all the paperwork that's not here today. Rotterdam signed up and says, I will take this guy's place, and he went. But then we've also got something else here that says Swartwood was again drafted in 1864, and I don't know the rest of the story. So I don't know if this is something that William H. Root, or rather Orville did, if he got somebody to go for him, or just how he got out of it. But he did not serve in the Civil War. In 1864, he took a trip west. And I want to go into that, but I want to double back first to Mariah, because the story around her also involves the Civil War. There is so little data on her, I can't figure out really what she did most of her life. But I can tell you this, that I found her obituary. And I think, as all of you know, you read obituaries and you can see when they were born, what they did in their life, when they died. Her obituary didn't say any of that. It was just that a beautiful soul was lost and a lot of friends were disappointed, blah, blah, blah. But I suspect that Mariah did a lot of teaching. Mariah ended up in the Freedmen's Bureau. All of you know what the Freedmen's Bureau is? No. Okay. No. Freedmen's Bureau was established by the government after the Civil War to help black folks who were escaping slavery to get a start in life. You heard the thing about a mule and 40 acres. But they would provide food, clothing, they provided education. Mariah found herself in the South after the Civil War, much to the chagrin of her parents. But something should be noted here is that they were disturbed by that because of the danger, but it became very well known in the Root family that they were very much for education, and if a woman wanted to go ahead and promote herself and be successful, do it. The guys had a reputation for tolerance. Do that. Now, she found herself very near, and she was outside Milledgeville, and she was very near a place called Andersonville. Most of you may know or have heard of the Andersonville prison. About half of its occupants died and did not make it out of captivity. So she was down there, and she was down there to teach people of color how to read and write. She waded through a smallpox epidemic. She apparently was vaccinated, so she didn't have a problem. And she and other teachers were also threatened by veterans from the Confederate Army as well as local citizens, who more or less said, "Don't you Yankees come down here and start teaching the colored folk how to read and write. We can take care of our own citizenry. You need to get out of here." And there is a part in one of her letters home where she said, "I could just spit on them all." So there's this female spirit in her and this drive to succeed. Before she came back, she was down there about 3 months. She visited the site of the Andersonville prison. And she brought this home. She also brought a key home. I'm told the key is down in the Oberlin College Museum. Where or what it unlocked in the prison, I have no idea. But this is a piece of the prison. It looks like a rail to me. Now, what I'm telling you now is, and by the way, this will be up here. What I'm telling you now is pure speculation on my part, but if you know anything about Andersonville Prison, you had a stockade, you had 30,000 guys inside. This looks like a rail, and it was known inside the Andersonville Prison that inside the wall, you came in 20 feet, there was a rail all the way around. 20 feet parallel to every wall. Step into the no man's land between that rail and the wall, we'll kill you. We'll shoot you. We don't want anybody anywhere near the walls. I suspect that this may have been part of that rail, just based on the shape. I don't know that though, it's speculation, but it did come from the prison. She came home and for the most part, she disappears into history. I suspect she was a teacher. I know she lived in Oberlin at the time she died, and she, like several of the other Roots, is buried in the old Garfield Cemetery on Route 254. So that is the story of Mariah. Now back to Orville. Orville took a trip out west during the Civil War. And like I said, I'm not sure why it was that he got out of the Civil War. But I'm going to read you some excerpts from a story that he wrote about his trip out there. And some of this is fairly unpleasant. If you think about taking a vacation today, it's easy. You can pull off, get a motel, get something to eat. Whole different story for this man. March 6, 1854. Henry Fitch, Daniel Mallory, Charlie Maddock, James Farragut, John O'Day, and Orville Root started from Sheffield to seek their fortunes in the wild and woolly West. Their objective point was Bannock, Idaho Territory. I can tell you now, they never made it there. They got sidetracked. They left on the 16th of March, arrived Chicago on the 17th in time for the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and then they left Chicago for Hannibal, Missouri. Here's an interesting experience they ran into. They arrived in Hannibal about 11:30 the next day, and being green and from the country and not used to city ways, some of the party hired a bus, quote, to transfer them from the depot to the ferry landing at the stipulated price of $1 each. The busman, after driving them around town for half an hour, opened the door and informed them that they had arrived at the ferry landing, which they afterward found out was directly across the street from the depot where they had arrived from. He calls that experience number 1. He then took cars that afternoon from Hannibal to St. Joe, which, by the way, was a launch point for a lot of the wagons going west. Had another experience with 2 Dutchmen on board. This was a train now. He had trains kind of east of St. Joe, and after that there was nothing. He said, took 2 cars that afternoon from Hannibal to St. Joe, had another experience with 2 Dutchmen. One of the boys sleeping in our car berth happened to be right next to the stove, which the colored porter insisted on keeping red hot. Standing this Turkish bath, as he calls it, for about a half hour, he got up, strolled back through the day coaches, and found 2 Germans who, with their coats and blankets, had made quite a comfortable couch of their seats. He informed them that riding in a sleeper always made him seasick, and he would exchange his berth with them for their seat. Well, that sounded pretty good. We get a berth from this guy, and he can have our seat. So he informed them of that. They went, he said more or less that they took the bear hook. That's what he called the bait. Gave up their seats, went to the sleeper, and got into the Turkish bath where they remained the rest of the night, much to their discomfort the next day, which they vividly expressed to him. There were bushwhackers along the railroad, so there were railroad robberies. They were not molested at the time he was there. The party got to St. Joe and they split. Some people were going to go to Denver. He and 2 or 3 other fellows were going to go on to Idaho. They got out to the North Platte, and they headed north up the north branch of the Platte. There was a little place called Julesburg. They headed then for Fort Laramie, Wyoming. During that trip, he became very, very ill. And he said his partners, Mallory and Farragher, would always look for a camp along the river where there was soft digging, because they didn't know at what minute Root might pass over to the great majority. And they were darned sure that it was not going to be very, very easy to lay him away unless they had soft soil to dig a grave. Nice guys. He said in that stage of the game when they were on horseback, there was a shortage of feedstock, grass was scattered, there was very little to eat, so it was a really bad place. Jumping over to Laramie, Wyoming in the fort, he said things got very comfortable. He managed to heal, and he also met a doctor from LaGrange, Ohio. He thought that was interesting. All right, now, he says, our first adventure in Willow Creek, they're up in Montana now, place they're mining. He said, we bought our claim from a fellow named Lars Logan. He said he was a nephew of Major Anderson of Sumter fame. Remember Robert Anderson? He was in Fort Sumter, and they surrendered to the Confederates. And knowing he was a brave and honorable man, we were sure his nephew wouldn't lie. But we found that Logan had deceived us, at least in respect to the claim. And it played out quite quickly. So, experience number 2. And then there's a lot of random stuff in here. He says, James Farragher, the youngest member of our company, was a noted bread maker. One day, Jim set empties in a tin can, must be leftovers, put them in a kettle over the stove to keep warm, put a stick of wood into the stove by way of a sheet iron type of affair, and it was a quick heater. And it quickly turned into a boiling pot of muck, so they didn't have bread for at least a day, much to his disappointment. He notes here another situation. He says, there were few Indians around camp, and the principal commodities for sale were ponies, some of which may have been kidnapped, who knows, and squaws. So there were women for sale. And the squaws, he says, a good, comely-looking squaw, good-looking squaw, $40. And a common-looking squaw, average appearance, 20 to 25. Keep in mind that when the Indians raided each other's villages and camps, they could kidnap people. And like, yeah, baby, you're coming with me, you know, that type of thing. And so this is probably what was happening to some of these women. He said the males were irregular. Sometimes there were Indian raids along the way, and so the letters got backed up. He said the first mouse that he saw in Montana got into the coffee pot, and we boiled him from day to day until the hair was all off of him. And I don't think we would have known that he was there until one of the fellas, have a strong stomach please, was drinking from the spout of the coffee pot and felt a long, thin thing laying on his tongue. And I thought, what in the hell? So, you know, like this, and they turn the pot over, and this hairless mouse falls out of the pot. So he said they've apparently been drinking out of that thing for 2-3 days without cleaning. This just wasn't any vacation for this guy. Okay. Irregular mails. He said the local post office was another real operation too. He said the postmaster was a fairly thrifty man, operated on a budget, but he says there was a grifter that operated in the post office with him. And he says the grifter would get magazines and paper that would come in, and he'd sell them for a profit. Old news, but it was coming from the east, so it was fresh stuff. Guys would buy the magazines, buy the papers. And then what he would also do is when the postmaster got a load of stamps, they were 2-cent stamps, he'd buy all the stamps up. And then you'd come into the post office, and I got to mail a letter. Well, you got to see him. So the grifter would sell you a 2-cent stamp for 25. So you had a crook operating in the post office along with the postmaster. And that didn't make people too happy either. He says the morals of the town, what they were looked after by a band of men who called themselves vigilantes. I don't know what your opinion of vigilantes is, but if you have bad guys, the vigilantes are barely better than the bad guys and use the bad of the bad guys so that they themselves can be bad guys. Thrift of any large amount was punished by death. He said the only execution I witnessed was that of a young man who stole about $1,000 from his partner and got away as far as Salt Lake City before he was captured. He was brought to Virginia City. This is Virginia City, Montana, not Virginia City, Nevada, where the big silver mines were. Tried, found guilty, and hung on a beef gallows. So they apparently had a slaughterhouse there where they'd get the big sides of beef, put them on a hanger. They took this guy over to the beef house and took care of him over there. Here's another one here that is not very appetizing. In my diary, under the date of August 1864, I find the following bill of fare entered. For dinner, camp by the roadside. Fine shortcake handmade. That's his version. Here's his version. Recipe, 1 cup of flour and dirt. 1 heaping teaspoon of saleratus, which actually is baking soda. 1 cup of water, baked in a Dutch oven. His description of the final result, sad. Second course, 1 raw onion. side dishes, 2 cold potatoes, and a drink from the brook where the horses drink. Slept on a haystack that night with 4 strange men as bedfellows. So this was just not panning out like he had anticipated. Okay, here's another story involving the post office again. He said people would stand out all night because mail from the east, thank you, mail from the east was really precious. And he said on the winter nights, he said there were some winter nights it was 10 below. You had 200 people lined up 4 in the morning out of the post office hoping for a letter when it opened at 6 o'clock. And he said people were plumb nuts. But then he had a story about a little fella named Scotty. I had a mixed reaction on this. I started to laugh about this. And then after I got into the story, I thought, how sad. So I'll tell you the story. His words. One of our party, known as Scotty, was a regular and is waiting for mail. But poor Scotty hadn't had any letter-writing friends and was disappointed after many long waits for letters. And so he's kind of pushing, why, if you don't know anybody who's going to write to you, why are you even out there to begin with? Finally, some of the boys conceived the idea of writing Scott a good, long, newsy letter made up of scraps from their own letters and drawing largely on their own vivid imaginations for the balance. Scott's letter was duly posted the next mail day, and after 3 hours of waiting, Scotty triumphantly returned, bearing his letter from home to one of the boys to have it read to him. As it turns out, Scotty could not read. So he's looking for a letter and he can't even read. The party to whom he took it happened to be the writer of the same. And Scotty, after listening to it, immediately proceeded to the 2 other parties of his acquaintances and imparted it to them, the information contained in the long-looked-for letter. And in some respects, it's funny, and yet how sad. Because this fellow out there can't even read or write, doesn't know anybody that's writing him a letter, and the guys try to write a letter for him to make him happy. He goes through a bunch of things in terms of pricing in pounds. I'm not going to bore you with that. He got into farming. He said in that particular area of Idaho, it was a rather dry area. They irrigated. They captured water from the creeks. And he said corn wouldn't grow there, but the crops they did grow were wheat, barley, oats, potatoes, and turnips. And he says the season was also short, so you were also pressed to get things in the spring. No fruit. Every now and then fruit came in from Salt Lake City. He got into a little bit of mining. He also did some farming. Again, he's quoting prices. And he said in the spring of 1867, having failed to get to Idaho, he was living on a ranch. And things really get short, so you can tell this man's getting just tired of this, because he's hand to mouth for 4 years, not even near the gold. In the spring of 1866, 1867, I lived on a ranch. So he's a ranch hand. In the spring of 1868, hauled timber 30 miles to the first quart mill erected in Rochester Gulch. Left Hill Creek on July 1st, 1868 for home. He just said, this is it, I'm leaving. His adventure comes to an end. He says, took the stage from Virginia City to Helena, thence to Fort Benton, which was the head of navigation on the Missouri River. He got home a month later, but what was interesting on the trip is that he was on a riverboat for 12 days going back down, and he says they only had enough fuel for 1 day. They'd run out of fuel, so they'd park the boat, they'd get off the boat and go cut and find dry wood, bring it back to the boat in tree lengths, put it on the boat, spend the night. Next morning they'd fire up the boilers, start cutting wood all day as they went down the river, run out of wood again, park the boat. This went on for 12 days. And he said that, he said, just drive you absolutely nuts. You want to go, 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 and you can't. He said, lastly, he finally reached home about August 1868, so he really cuts this thing short. I think he just finally said one day, I'm done. I'm out of here, I'm going home. The dream of gold never occurred. Now, when he came home, he became also a prominent member of the community. He got into banking. He became Lorraine County Auditor for 3 terms in the late 1870s and 80s. He got married in 1878 to a gal named Sarah Howe, H-O-W-E. That wedding took place at, I don't think we have a picture, oh, there it is. This is a 1910 picture of the Root House. But he was married at that home to Sarah in 1878. One of 5 weddings that have taken place in that house. And I think I checked one time with Ben Norton, whose family has had the home since the 70s. I think you said, Ben, that there have been no wedding venues in the home since you've been there. Is that correct? Okay. So we had 5 weddings between its construction in 1910. So he was married, moved to Elyria, and in the 1880s, he and his wife had 2 daughters. The first daughter was Frances Elizabeth Root. She'll be discussed next year. The other was Harriet Root, who I discussed last year, 2 years ago. All right. That brings us down. And by the way, I have paperwork on him because he also became Lorraine County Auditor for 3 terms. He was a Justice of the Peace as well. I have a lot of his certificates up here in the book. All this stuff just got kept. All right, some early pictures of Lorraine. By the way, Orville was involved in the Lorraine Banking Company. How many of you remember the Lorraine Banking Company? A few hands. 6th and Broadway, I think it's now a legal office. And in the Great Depression of 1908, the Lorraine Banking Company, which was only 3 years old, was headed for bankruptcy. He was basically, Orville, retired, and they said, can you come down to the bank and pull us out? So he said, well, I'm retired, but I'll come down there. You're going to have to do what I tell you to do. You try to tell me to do anything else, I'm leaving. So he went down there for about 2 years, 3 years. He ran the place, pulled him out of bankruptcy, and one day he came in and he said, this is my last day, I'm going back into retirement again. And that was it for him, although he also apparently became an advisor to Citizens, I believe, which was a local.
Is he on the right or the left?
Pardon me?
Is he on the right or the left?
He's neither of those two. Those were gentlemen affiliated with the bank in its early days.
One is Hageman and the other is Pierce.
That's correct.
Hageman is on, I think he's on the left.
I think he's the left.
Yeah, and then Pierce is on the right.
Yeah.
And Lorraine Banking is Lorraine National.
Yeah, it's now Lorraine National.
Bank.
Now it's, well, it's something else.
Northwest.
Northwest. Thank you. All right. Lastly, I think we come to, there's Orville in his senior days. By the way, he became ill in 1919 in retirement. He wasn't feeling well, and he said, you know, I'm going to go south. The air will be milder. The air will have more moisture in it. I think some of this northern dry air is not doing me any good. 2 weeks into the trip, he was deceased, and they brought him back. He's in the Garfield Cemetery. All right, this is a pair of roots that is really a great thing to finish up with. If I had to go to the cemetery and resurrect 2 men, Will and Walt, the Root twins would be it. There is, there's a lot of controversy around them. In fact, the record is kind of scant. There's mystery that surrounds them in many respects. They were considered to be a pair of eccentrics. We know they were involved in some type of show business. I have a copy of a program. I'm going to read this to you verbatim. I think you'll want to hear this because it's out of this world. Family reflections about them are varied. Now, I have a 4th cousin named Eddie Herdendorf, and some of you may know who he is. He lives over in Sheffield. He's descended from Aaron. Okay? Aaron was, of course, the Underground Railroad individual. I asked him one time, I said, do you know anything about Will and Walt? So he went and asked his aunt, Ruth Hammer, what do you know about Ruth? Ruth, what do you know about the twins? And he said, she clammed up right away, just this kind of thing. And just didn't say anything. And finally she said, I don't think they did anything wrong. So he came back and told me that. So he says, that's the report for me. I have no idea. I was with Harriet Root one day, my great aunt, and Will and Walt subject came up, and I said, yeah, but what about Will and Walt? And my great aunt stiffened up, and she kind of looked at me, and her voice rose, and she said, they spent their inheritance. And I thought, what the heck is this all about with these guys? So if you look at some of the comments on them from the Day Austin Root reunions, they had his historian every year. And there's some great comments about these fellas. Jovial, fun to be with, great conversationalists, and yet there's this aura that something was not quite right about these guys. I can't tell you really what they did for a living. I can tell you in one respect that Walter, along with his brother, Orville, who I just discussed, played a role in the establishment of the early streetcar system in Lorraine. I don't know how much you know about that. It started it started down on 16th, 17th Street. There was a little maintenance house down there. There was no electricity, so the streetcars were pulled by horses. And you could go from there down to the Loop, 50 cents one way. They had to turn around the Loop and they went back. The only dangerous part of the trip was crossing what are the Norfolk and Southern tracks. So they had crossbars there. So another thing that came up one day was that there was a gathering at the Root household over here on the east side, and people went swimming. Several people were swimming in the lake. It was a sunny day, the lake was warm, and somebody said, Walter, what are you reading the paper for? He was down there with his suit on, reading the paper, and he said, come on in, the water's fine. So Walter says, okay. Walked over, picked up a beach chair, threw it into the lake, and with his suit, waded in and plopped himself in the beach chair and floated out into the lake reading the newspaper. What are you going to do with your suit, Walter? Oh, I got another one back at the house. So some of this stuff just didn't make sense, but all right. So they were born in 1847, which I think, Ben, you told me you and Jane had visited the county courthouse. That was the year the house was completed? Okay, thank you. There were 8 people in that house at the time. All of the girls were still there. Orville was there, the twins were there. So there were a lot of folks inside there, besides Orville and his wife. But this is, you can't see this, I'll have it up here. This is a little flyer. Yeah, there you go. And it says here, there's only one pair of them, a couple of Roots. Well, yeah, there's 2 people in a pair, right? A couple. The famous Root twins, Will and Walt, in their integral lecture, quote, different things guaranteed to destroy, utterly annihilate 2 hours of time for those that have that much left over. To hear them is to never forget. God, I wish I could have met these guys. All right, here's the back of this flyer. Please be patient with me. A couple of Roots. The lecture treats, incidentally, of the case with which an American citizen may rise in the territories. Keep in mind, not all U.S. property was yet states. May rise in the territories when he has a rope tied around his neck with a few personal friends at the other end of the rope. It also treats the various styles of oratory particular to America, with the choicest selections from Artemus Ward, Bill Nye, Mark Twain, and others that have been pressed and dried especially for this entertainment. It is a good lecture, and the few scattering facts contained in it do not interfere with the lecture itself in any way. We will appear in our best clothes at each lecture. Persons attending the lecture need not be identified. Gentlemanly ushers will go through the audience to keep the flies away from those who wish to sleep during the lecture. Should the lecture be encored at its close, it will be repeated only once. This encore business is being overdone lately, we think. The following press notices from some of the leading newspapers will be of interest. I really think a lot of this, pardon my French, is just BS, but there's implications. They were in the Klondike in South Africa here, but I'll let you judge for yourself. The Klondike Bung Starter says, quote, "The Root brothers opened their lecture here last evening with a can opener. It was found to be in good order. As soon as the doors were opened, there was a mad rush for seats, during which 3 men were fatally injured. They insisted on remaining through the lecture, however, and adding to its horrors. Dead men at the lecture. Before 5 o'clock, 500 people had been turned away. The lecturers announced that they would deliver a matinee this afternoon, but they were petitioned by the merchants of the town to refrain from doing so, as it would paralyze the business of the city to such a degree that they offered to buy the house and allow the lecturers to cancel their engagement." The South African News says the great lecturers, Root brothers, closed last night their 6 weeks of engagement here with their famous lecture on the rise and fall of the American horse thief, with a grand ovation of benefit. The elite of the city was present, many of whom have attended every evening for 6 weeks to hear this same lecture. Those who can afford it will follow those lectures back to the States, where they can hear this lecture almost continuously. The lectures at the beginning of the season offered a prize to anyone who should not be absent or tardy during the 6 weeks. After some hot discussion, the prize was awarded to the janitor of the hall. The Root brothers will sail for America on the Servia tomorrow. On their arrival in America, they will at once pay off the national debt and fund a large asylum for American dudes whose mothers are too old to take in washing and support their son-in-laws. You may make your own interpretation. Whatever you want goes, I don't care. So you can see there was a mystery around these fellas. Well, I do have a photograph at home, and it was taken at Walter's house in Elyria in 1896. I should have brought that this morning, but I was remiss. But Walter died in Cleveland in 1907. I'm not sure what that cause was. But as I said, he was one of the early people on the streetcars. Will became a real connoisseur of the Day Austin Burton reunions, and it is noted that he was kind of a highlight in those things. He loved going to the family reunions and did so religiously each and every year. He passed away in early 1919. Oddly enough, Orville, who I told you about, passed away that same year in 1919. Now there's one other item I want to mention going back to Orville. His daughter, Frances Elizabeth Root, who became my grandmother, was married to Albert Keyes Hibbard. That's where the tie came in between the two families. They were married in 1910 in the doorway of the Root home. This photograph here was taken in an area of the Root brothers and their wives. They immediately went to England, where my grandfather-to-be was the manager of Underwood and Underwood's London office. So about 2 years later, Orville and his wife received a telegram from Albert Keyes Hibbard and Frances that they have a brand new son, Robert Root, who would become my father. He was born on February 6, 1912. So they made arrangements to go to England to depart about April 20th of 1912. They ran into a serious problem in New York. If you want to know what the problem is, you'll have to come back next year. I appreciate all of you staying with me because there is just so much here to cram into my old 80-year-old brain. But I hope you've gotten something out of this. How long have we run?
We're at about an hour.
Oh, that's not bad. Are there any questions from any of you?
You know, David, it's important for people to realize that Walden and the two twins, they were actually on a speaking tour, and this was not unusual during
Yeah,
that time. Mark
that is-
Twain was one of the most.
Right, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, they devised, this really was a devised speaking tour on their part. And that little flyer probably answers as many questions as questions that may raise. Yes?
I don't know if you know anything about the Pioneer Cemetery on River Road, East River. Are any of the Roots buried there, or any of your relatives?
Henry and Mary are in there.
And
He's
they
the one that
are-
came, he's the one that brought the family to Ohio. And he
Oh.
would have been my 3 greats-grandfather. That's who's in there. Now, there are some other individuals. I think there's about 10 individuals in there. I'm not for sure, but he and his wife are 2 of those people.
And that's who now, Henry and,
Mary, it was Mary Day who became Mary Day Root.
and the Days own that land across the road?
That is
Where the
correct.
hill is,
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, the Days were right across the road from there.
where I used to go Boy Scouting.
Yeah. Yes.
I was gonna say, my Girl Scout troop, when I was in, I think it was 7th grade, we would go to that cemetery and clean it up, cut the grass, plant flowers, try to make it look a little,
Right.
more
Decent. Yeah.
presentable.
Right.
Because it was much unattended a lot.
There were many times I drove by there and noted weeds and
Yeah,
the general poor condition of the
yeah,
place.
so we would take care of it.
Thank you.
Is there a sexton for that?
Pardon me?
Is there a sexton who takes care of the cemetery?
No, I don't know. It was just one of those, we had to earn a badge, and that's what we picked to do.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been a regular pattern of care for that cemetery, and I'm not sure that it's ever really fallen under any government entity. But it's, if you're going by and you want to clean it up, great.
Yeah.
Henry, thanks.
That's what
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah. Any others? Yes?
Did any of the roots come from Austria?
Not to my knowledge. If any of them did, I'm not aware of it.
Because my great-grandmother was Ellen. I just wondered if she had.
Yeah, most everything that I know about the Roots goes back to England. There was a pair of Root brothers that were here in the 1630s, and the family split between those two. The one brother lived in Salem, where the witch trials took place, and the other brother was down the road in Farmington, and the people I'm talking about today and myself are the Farmington branch. The other day I had a conversation with my wife Elaine over here. I told her, I said, I'm tempted to look at the Salem branch to see if any of those who were accused of witchcraft or any of the people who were the accusers were Roots. And I think you said you had done that, and the Roots came clean. There were no Roots involved in Salem, either as witchcraft people or accusers. Yes?
David, the Roots arrived, you said in 1816, and they built the house in 1847. Where did they live in that area? Any idea?
Yeah, I just had a question from somebody the other day. They had a framed house because that was about the time where log cabins were beginning to disappear and frame housing was coming in. They had a framed house that is northwest of your location, probably about 1,000 feet. So if you want to mark that location, you drift out over the lake, 25 feet above the water, and that spot is long gone. And they were just northwest of the location of what is your home. Yes.
Regarding that cemetery, I believe Annette Corio, I don't know her maiden name, she lived right next door, and that she had mentioned that the cemetery was actually on her family's property. It was part of her family's property. And then when her father passed away, they made sure that Sheffield Village, I believe the lot was split. And,
Okay.
They took it over, so.
Yeah, I've really never heard of the origins of how it got there, but I know a lot of your family cemeteries started on private property and went from there. Thank you. Anything else?
David, tell them how much property actually was in the Root family, so people have an idea that.
All right. Yeah, I think this question came up at the other presentation. There we go. No, this is a map of Lorraine in its earlier days, and you see the star up there? That's where the William H. Root home is. As I said, Ben Norton, who was here this morning, he and his family have had the property since the 70s. Almost going directly south from that, you can see, thank you, right there, yeah, that line, Root Road, was the center of the family's holdings.
The center.
Center line. It ran as far west as Euclid Avenue and as far east as, how many of you remember the old Vions or Vions Motel and Restaurant? Yeah, fish fries Friday night, that day. Yeah. It was somewhere in there, and from the lake to the river, including the island, was originally owned by the Roots. Now, Henry started with it. William H. had all of it. And then it got divided. When William H. passed away in 1889, Orville got Root Road to the east, and the Root brothers took everything to the west. And the Root brothers proceeded very quickly to spend their inheritance. I've often said, and it's been said within the family, that the Roots really weren't extraordinarily wealthy, but they were prosperous, but they had a lot of land. They didn't have money, they had land. And ultimately, that's where their wealth came from, was farming. It was run by every Root, as I've mentioned. They were all very, very successful farmers. But as time went on, they started to do other things. Yes.
All right, is this family related to the Roots in North Ridgeville? The Root?
I know there's a Root Road, when you're on the turnpike, you can go under the one bridge. There probably is a distant connection back somewhere. I don't know where it's at. I can't give you a definitive answer. The other thing to add to your question is, all of you have heard of Rootstown, Ohio? Yeah. That route, that may contain roots from both sides. Don't know that for sure, but there are a lot of people named Root over there.
So how many sons did William have? One boy and the twins?
He had 3 daughters on his first marriage, and then he had 3 sons on his second marriage. William H. So you had half brothers, half sisters. And that was not uncommon because there were so many things that could kill you back then that marriages were broken up by childbirth, disease, dysentery. Yes.
I think part of that the Roots holdings there on the east side of Lorraine, that was originally Sheffield Township, a lot of that.
That is correct.
It was later annexed by Lorraine.
Yeah, that is correct. The property line today runs about 300 feet east of Root Road, and part of that got set up around 1920 because it was all Sheffield. Then eventually the property line moved out, and then Sheffield Lake also got formed. So what started out as Sheffield has shrunk in several ways. Yes.
Also, in that small cemetery on East River Road near the Burrow House, the Bay Root family pioneer cemetery, there are 3 Roots buried there. There's Henry and Mary, and also Eliza, the first wife of William H.
She is in there, I did not know
Yeah,
that.
she's in there.
I've not
She was
investigated
the
it.
first burial there, age 25.
Thank you for that, because I was unaware of that. Any other questions?
My comment, David, that the house is in Lorraine, the lot next door to Sheffield Lake.
You are divided. Yeah, I don't know how accurate this is, but if you were to go out to the property and you pull into the driveway that leads to, down the east side of this is a more modern view of the house. That's where the boundary line is. They say it almost goes down the center of the drive. I don't know, have you ever had it surveyed?
We have surveyed the garage or the horse barn is in Lorraine, just on the edge of the horse barn.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was all or part, but
There are
that,
stakes there.
okay, so it's, the boundary goes just east of that. The garage is, as he said, was an old horse barn. And there was still another dwelling over there. It was a summer cottage that was part of the main barn. And we have photographs, which I know you've got copies of the old barn. It was torn, not torn down, but it was lowered off its stone base, turned into a cottage. And that was eventually destroyed by vandals.
By what?
Vandals, burned,
Oh, Gurman.
burned,
Gurman.
yeah. There's 2 longtime friends sitting here, they know what I'm talking about. Oh yes, and the wife of a longtime friend. I'm sorry, Judy. All right, anything else? I want to thank all of you for coming down here and tolerating me today. I hope you leave here with a little better knowledge of the roots. It's a difficult presentation for me because there is just so much. But I feel fortunate in that, unlike other people who just don't know anything about anybody who was ahead of them, I know a lot about that stuff.
Will this be on YouTube?
Yes, they're going to put this maybe within 30 days, whenever.
Yeah, we have our own YouTube channel. I'm not sure when it will be uploaded, but yeah, I'm sure we'll.
You might, I don't know if you're aware of it, but my presentation that I gave back in 2022 on Harriet Root, that is on the internet, so that's available. If you want to go straight out for it, put in Harriet Root -YouTube, and almost the first listing will say Dave Hibbard's presentation of.
Well, Dave, we'd like to thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure he's willing to stay for a while if we have other questions in mind.
I'll be here for a little bit, yes.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.